What if I told you that the way you received communion last Sunday was considered a mortal scandal by your grandparents' generation, and that the specific measurable physical changes to the Mass were not accidental, nor were they merely cultural shifts? What if I told you that in the span of a single lifetime, the Church effectively erased 5 distinct mandatory behaviors that were once considered the primary signs of a Catholic in the state of grace? I have spent 40 years looking through the dust of library archives, smelling the decay of vellum, and tracing the heavy ink lines of the Roman Missal of 1962, and I can tell you that the erosion of these practices was not an accident of history. It was a calculated departure. If you have ever walked into a modern church and felt a distinct, cold emptiness, where there should have been a sense of the sacred, you were not imagining it. You were reacting to the absence of these 5 ancient guardrails. Most Catholics today have never seen a true altar rail in its original context. They have never felt the sharp discipline of a midnight fast. They have never heard the rhythmic strike of the breast during the Confiteor. I am going to take you back to a time before these things were quietly dropped. Back to a time when the sacred was protected not by intention, but by ironclad bodily habit. I remember clearly the first time I held a pre-1965 missal in my hands. I was a young seminarian, arrogant in my modern education, convinced that the past was simply a rough draft of the present. An old Monsignor, a man who had served at the altar under Pope Pius XII, caught me turning the pages of his 1956 missal with a casual, dismissive flip of the wrist. He grabbed my wrist with a grip that surprised us both. He looked me in the eye and said, "You are handling a map to heaven, boy, not a newspaper. Every rubric in here is a lighthouse on a rocky coast." That moment haunts me to this day. He knew what was coming. He saw that we were about to dismantle the very architecture of reverence. I am about to share with you the 5 things that every Catholic did before the year 1965. Practices that have been minimized, mocked, or outright abolished in the decades since. If you listen to me closely, if you let these historical facts settle into your mind, you will begin to understand why the modern experience of Mass feels so unmoored. This is not about nostalgia, it is about spiritual survival. You deserve to know what was taken from you, and more importantly, why. To understand the gravity of what we have lost, we must first look at the context of the liturgical horizon.
They removed 47 prayers from the Catholic Mass between 1955 and 1975. I compiled every single one, original Latin, English, the exact Pope, the exact Vatican document, the forgotten Catholic prayer book. Ebook in description and first comment posted.
Prior to the seismic shift of the Second Vatican Council, for centuries, the Mass was a fortress of unchanging ritual. Pope St. Pius V in 1570 promulgated the Bull Quo Primum, which essentially locked the Roman Rite into a form that would persist virtually unchanged for 400 years. This was not a stifling of creativity, it was a preservation of the precious. In that era, the laity were not passive observers, they were active participants, through a physical language of reverence that was universal. Whether you were in Paris, Manila, or New York, a Catholic knew exactly how to approach the altar. There was a shared, physical grammar of the faith. This unity was the first casualty of the modern age. We are often told that these changes were made to help us understand the Mass better, to make us more involved. But I ask you to look at the result. Has the removal of these 5 distinct practices made us more holy? Has the elimination of the altar rail made us more reverent? The historical record suggests the opposite. When you lower the barrier to the infinite, you do not make the infinite more accessible, you make it seem common, and eventually, disposable. The transition began, with subtle allowances, perhaps with the best of intentions, but it ended with a complete overhaul of Catholic etiquette. In 1964, the instruction Inter Ecumenici was issued by the Sacred Congregation of Rites. This document is the smoking gun the blueprint for the removal of the ancient safeguards. It was the first step in the quiet dropping of traditions that had defined the Catholic identity for generations. Let us walk through these 5 practices one by one, and I will show you exactly what they meant, why they mattered, and what their absence has cost us. The first practice that has been almost entirely eradicated from the modern experience is the reception of Holy Communion while kneeling at the altar rail. I want you to picture this in your mind. In 1950, in any parish church in the world, at the moment of communion, you would not see a line of people walking up the center aisle. You would see a shuffle of penitents moving toward the altar rail, which was that low barrier separating the sanctuary, representing heaven, from the nave, representing the world, or the church militant. When you reached that rail, you did not stand, you fell to your knees. This was not optional. This was the law of the church. You knelt on a humble cushion, often worn thin by the knees of thousands before you, and you waited. You waited for the priest, the mediator of the Christ, to come to you. You did not approach God on your own 2 feet, asserting your equality or your status.
They removed 47 prayers from your church. Demons fear everyone, and every night you don't pray to them. Your home is unguarded. The forgotten Catholic prayer book restores all 47. Open it tonight. Pray one before sleep. Hand it to the next priest who says they never existed. Link in first posted comment and description.
You approached him in the posture of a supplicant, of a servant, of a creature before the Creator. This was the theology of the body made manifest. To receive the King of Kings while standing, walking, or chewing gum is a contradiction in terms that our ancestors would have found incomprehensible, if not blasphemous. Why was this changed? The documents issued in the 1960s began to speak of full, conscious, and active participation, a noble phrase that was weaponized against the very physical acts that manifested participation. The argument was made that standing was the posture of the resurrection, the posture of glory. While it is true that we will stand in the glory of heaven, we are presently on earth, in the valley of tears. We are in the midst of the Via Dolorosa. The altar rail was the front line of the spiritual battle. When the instruction Inter Oecumenici began to suggest that countries could adapt the posture of the faithful, the rail was the first obstacle to be removed. If you remove the rail, you cannot kneel comfortably. If you cannot kneel comfortably, you will eventually stand. And if you stand, the psychological dynamic shifts. You are no longer receiving a gift. You are taking a commodity. This change was not merely architectural. By removing the altar rail and encouraging standing communion, the architects of the new liturgy severed the physical connection between the act of receiving and the act of adoration. When I ask you to look at the ancient manuscripts, the Codex Sinaiticus, the Didache, the writings of the early Church Fathers, you see a profound emphasis on the fear of God. Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon God. The altar rail was the place where the modern Catholic encountered that same terrifying, beautiful awe. It was the threshold where the infinite touched the finite. Now we walk across it as if it were a finish line at a charity marathon. The loss of the rail and the forced posture of standing has stripped the communion line of its penitential character. We have traded the humility of the kneeling supplicant for the pride of the walking consumer. This is a historical fact you can verify by looking at any footage of a papal mass prior to 1965. Look at the faces, look at the slowness, look at the stillness. That is the reverence we have traded for efficiency. This brings us inexorably to the second practice that was quietly dropped, and it is intimately connected to the first, the absolute prohibition against receiving communion in the hand. Before 1965, if you were to hold out your hand to receive the Eucharist, you would have been struck with confusion, and likely refused communion until you could demonstrate that you understood the gravity of the sacrament. The universal law of the Latin Church for centuries was that only the consecrated hands of the priest could touch the body of Christ. There were rare exceptions in history, but by the time of the Council of Trent, this was a settled issue. The Church declared that the custom of only the priest distributing communion and the recipient receiving it directly on the tongue was an apostolic tradition. It was not a medieval invention. It was the ancient way of safeguarding the real presence. Think about the logic of this. If you truly, truly believe that what is being placed before you is not a symbol, not a piece of bread, but the literal physical flesh of the Creator of the universe, the Alpha and the Omega, how would you dare to extend your hands to grab it? We are talking about a reality that would burn the sun if it were fully unveiled. We are talking about a mystery that the angels tremble to look upon. To handle it with our human hands, hands that are often unwashed, hands that touch money and dirt and sinful things, was considered a profound irreverence. It was a violation of the sacred boundary. I have studied the history of this change meticulously, and I must tell you, it was imposed through a method of pastoral experimentation that is truly shocking. In 1969, Pope Paul VI, in his encyclical letter Memoriale Domini, actually affirmed that the traditional practice of receiving on the tongue was the more venerable and the safer practice. He acknowledged that the vast majority of the bishops consulted around the world did not want the change to communion in the hand. And yet the practice was allowed to spread through an indult, a special permission, initially in Holland and a few other places, and then, like a leak in a dam, it spread everywhere. The Holy Father warned that this change could lead to a loss of reverence. He was right. When you hold the host in your own hand, the tactile feedback creates a false sense of possession. You are handling the object. It is in your control. The illusion of control is the enemy of faith. The ancient tradition of receiving on the tongue was an act of total surrender. You opened your mouth like a baby bird or like a beggar and allowed the priest to feed you. It was a moment of total dependency. Those words, which once preceded every reception, were a preparation for the complete helplessness of the act. Now, we take, we chew, we move on. The fragments of the host that fall to the floor in a, quote, communion in the hand scenario would have horrified the saints of the past. St. Cyril of Jerusalem, writing in the 4th century, instructed the faithful to come forward with fear and trembling, and to receive the Eucharist with the palm of the right hand formed into a throne, but even then, he warned them to consume it immediately, so that not even a crumb would be lost. Yet the modern practice of carrying it back to the pew would have been unthinkable to him. The dropping of the tongue-only rule is the single greatest indicator of a shift in belief regarding the real presence. It is the physical manifestation of the theological erosion of the doctrine. We no longer act as if we believe what we say we believe. And that is a tragedy that I, as a scholar, can only document with tears in my eyes. The third practice brings us to a moment of deep, personal intimacy with God. A physical movement that has been reduced to a mere flick of the wrist. Through my fault, through my fault, through my most grievous fault. Before the changes of 1965, the penitential rite at the beginning of Mass was not a quick mumble of generic words. It was a confrontation with sin. The Confiteor was a rigorous examination of conscience, spoken aloud in the presence of the entire congregation. But the key was the physical act. You did not just say the words. You struck your breast. Once, twice, 3 times. And the third time, with the utterance of mea maxima culpa, you struck harder. You felt the impact. You felt the thud of your fist against your chest. This was a somatic reminder of the reality of sin. It was a way of saying, the sin is not out there, it is in here. It is in me. The words were in Latin, yes, but the language of the fist against the chest was universal. It bypassed the intellect and went straight to the heart. The reformers of the 1960s decided that this was too negative. They felt that the focus on sinfulness and guilt was detrimental to the modern psyche. They wanted to emphasize the resurrection and the glory of God, rather than the fallen nature of man. And so, the Confiteor was shortened. The specific triple striking of the breast was softened, often reduced to a single gentle tap, and in many places it is done by almost no one in the congregation. The words mea maxima culpa were excised entirely from the English translation. You will hear, through my fault, through my fault, through my most grievous fault in some newer translations, but the physical act of striking the breast 3 times has been effectively dropped. This is a suppression of the biblical anthropology of the human person. Scripture tells us that the heart is deceitful above all things. Jeremiah asks, "The heart is deceitful." The ancients knew this. They knew that sin was not a mistake. It was a wound. To strike the breast was to apply a spiritual tourniquet. It was to accept responsibility for the darkness within. By removing this physical gesture, we have sanitized the beginning of the Mass. We have turned the penitential rite into a mere formality, a get-it-over-with moment, rather than the vital purging of the soul that prepares us to enter the Holy of Holies. If you are walking through your own valley right now, if you feel the weight of your own errors, you need this physical release. It is a truth that the modern church is afraid to speak, but it is the only truth that sets you free. The 4th practice I must tell you about is a visual testament to the order of creation itself, the veiling of women. In 1965, if you were a woman or a girl entering a church, you would not dream of doing so with your head uncovered. It was simply not done. This practice was not a cultural relic from the 1950s. It was a direct application of the Pauline doctrine found in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, where St. Paul instructs that a woman ought to have a veil on her head because of the angels. For centuries, canon law actually mandated this. The 1917 Code of Canon Law, specifically Canon 1262, stated plainly that women, whether in church or outside the church, when assisting at Mass, must be veiled. This was not a suggestion, it was the law. And yet, by the late 1960s, this practice evaporated almost overnight. Why? Because the prevailing narrative became that this was a sign of oppression, a sign of the inferior status of women. That is a gross misreading of the theological reality. The veil was a sign of mystery and dignity. It covered the glory of the woman so that God's glory could shine forth. It was a recognition that the woman is the vessel of life, the created crown of the world, and that in the house of God, she signifies the church, the bride of Christ. The church is veiled, just as the sanctuary was veiled. I have looked at the commentaries on this passage, and the dropping of the veil represents a loss of the sacred distinction between the sexes and a loss of the sense of the supernatural. The angels are present at the Mass. St. Paul taught this explicitly. The veil was a sign of reverence to the angelic powers present at the sacrifice. When we dropped this practice, we declared to the angels that we no longer cared about their protocols, that we no longer cared about the celestial order. We acted as if we were the masters of the liturgy. The 1983 Code of Canon Law, the updated version following Vatican II, is silent on the issue. It does not mandate the veil, but it does not forbid it either. However, the cultural pressure against it became so intense that a woman wearing a veil today is often looked upon with pity or confusion. This is a tragedy. We have lost a public, visible sign of female dignity and humility. We have lost a symbol that separates the sanctuary of the church from the commerce of the street. If you ever find yourself in an old church and you see a painting of the saints, look at the women. They are veiled. Mary is veiled. We have stripped the daughters of Eve of their visual connection to the Mother of God under the guise of liberation, but we have actually succeeded only in desacralizing them. This is a profound loss to the visual language of the Mass, and it is one of the clearest examples of a practice being quietly dropped to satisfy modern secular sensibilities rather than divine instruction. And finally, we come to the 5th practice, the Eucharistic fast. Before 1965, a Catholic did not eat or drink from the midnight before receiving communion. This was the rule. Absolute, total, and rigorous. You woke up, you went to Mass, and you received the bread of life on an empty stomach. This physical hunger was meant to mirror the spiritual hunger of the soul. It was a discipline that required intentionality. You had to plan your life around the Mass. You had to sacrifice. This fast was not merely a rule, it was a spiritual exercise. It was the way you prepared your body to receive the body of Christ. The Church understood that the flesh is weak, and that to discipline the body was to strengthen the spirit. The midnight fast was a declaration that the Eucharist was more important than breakfast, more important than the morning coffee, more important than the comforts of the flesh. But then came the gradual relaxation. In 1957, Pope Pius XII, in his Apostolic Constitution Sacram Communionem, reduced the fast from midnight to 3 hours. Then, in 1964, Pope Paul VI reduced it further to 1 hour. And while a 1-hour fast is still a law of the Church, the impact of the change has been catastrophic for the spiritual discipline of the faithful. The midnight fast was a border that you had to cross. It made the reception of communion a distinct event, set apart from the mundane routines of daily life. When you reduce the fast to 1 hour, which you can easily satisfy by skipping a sip of coffee on the drive to church, the sense of anticipation and sacrifice is almost entirely lost. The hunger that should drive us to the altar is replaced by mere routine. I have sat with the old decrees, and I can see the logic of the relaxations, to make it easier for workers and the sick to receive. But the law of prayer is the law of belief, and the law of fasting is the law of desire. By lowering the bar so significantly, the Church inadvertently communicated that the Eucharist was less of a solemn summit and more of a casual snack. The midnight fast was the fifth and final guardrail that kept the approach to the altar steep and narrow. We flattened the hill, and now we walk up it with our hands in our pockets, forgetting that we are approaching Calvary. This change, perhaps more than any other, reflects the modern loss of asceticism. We no longer want to suffer, even a little, for our God. We want comfort at all times, even at the moment of communion. These 5 practices, the kneeling at the rail, the reception on the tongue, the striking of the breast, the wearing of the veil, and the midnight fast, were not optional accessories to the faith. They were the physical framework that held the spiritual reality in place. They were the heritage of the Roman Rite, passed down from the apostles, codified by councils, protected by popes. And they were dropped. Quietly, efficiently, and with a speed that should make any historian suspicious. If you have ever felt that the modern Mass lacks the weight of the past, you now know why. You have been handed a stripped version of the treasure. You have been given the form without the force. But knowledge is the first step to recovery. I have told you these things not to discourage you, but to arm you. Now that you know what has been lost, you can begin to reclaim it. You can kneel, even if others stand. You can strike your breast, even if others fold their arms. You can fast, even if the law asks for less. You can be the keeper of the flame in a generation that has lost the fire. What you have heard today is not my opinion. It is the history of your Church, documented in the decrees of the Sacred Congregation of Rites, in the words of Popes Pius V, Pius XII, and Paul VI, and in the lived memory of the faithful who are still with us. The suppression of these practices is a matter of historical record, and it is a tragedy of our time. I am asking you to carry this knowledge with you. Do not let these traditions die in the archives. Share this with someone walking through their own valley right now, someone who feels the coldness of the modern liturgy, but does not know why. Subscribe, so that I can keep bringing you the full text, the original meaning, and the undiluted truth of the ancient way. The Church is a mother, and a mother never forgets the way she held her children in the past. We must remember for her. Pax tecum. Peace be with you.